The plane was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet, engines humming in the background, passengers reclining in their seats with books, screens, or thoughts keeping them occupied. It was just another transatlantic flight, the kind that was both forgettable and exhausting, the kind where no one expected anything remarkable to happen. Seat 14C was occupied by a woman who blended into the anonymity of the cabin. She wasn't dressed in uniform, carried no obvious markings of distinction, and kept mostly to herself. To the casual observer, she was simply another passenger on a long-haul flight. But hidden in her quiet demeanor was a story that would shake the aircrew to their core and leave even the hardened F-16 pilots outside. The windows stunned into silence. The flight attendants had already served the first round of drinks, and the cabin was settling into its rhythm. A baby cried a few rows ahead, someone was snoring across the aisle, and a teenage boy was flipping through a comic book. It could have been any flight, anywhere in the world. In row 14, the woman leaned against the armrest, her eyes half closed, as though sleep might come to her if she just willed it. But her mind wasn't on sleep. She had flown hundreds of times before, in aircraft much smaller, faster, and infinitely louder than this passenger jet. Civilian flights never felt normal to her. They always reminded her of the gap between who she had been and who she was now. Hours into the flight, as the plane crossed into NATO airspace, a ripple of tension moved quietly through the cockpit. Pilots in the cockpit had received a coded message from ground control. Unidentified military activity detected along their corridor. Civilian pilots weren't always given full details, but they were told enough to know that there might be fighter escorts in the area. For most of the passengers, nothing would change. They would sip their drinks, watch their films, and have no idea of the invisible chess game playing out in the skies above them. But for the woman in 14C, this was the moment when her past, so carefully tucked away, would return. Outside, two F-16s closed in, flying fast and tight, silhouettes cutting against the endless blue. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured, telling passengers there was nothing to worry about, just standard protocol as they passed through controlled zones. Most passengers didn't even glance up, or if they did, they thought the sight of fighter jets was thrilling, like something out of a movie. A man near the window snapped photos with his phone. But in 14C, the woman sat very still, her lips pressed together, her gaze fixed on the wing. She had seen F-16s before, she had commanded them. The jets kept their distance at first, holding formation. But then came the moment that shifted everything. Through the intercom system reserved for emergencies, the flight deck received an unusual transmission, a call sign, a name. One that wasn't random, one that belonged to someone very specific. The woman in 14C heard it too. Her spine straightened before she even realized it. The fighter pilots outside weren't just flying an escort pattern, they were calling for her. It was impossible, she thought at first. She hadn't used that call sign in years. She hadn't expected anyone to remember it, let alone recognize her on a crowded passenger flight. Yet the sound of it echoed in her ears like it was yesterday, pulling her back to deserts of the Middle East, to nights where the sky glowed with tracer fire, to missions flown in silence and secrecy. The call sign had once been her identity, her shield, her legend. Now it was a ghost she couldn't ignore. She asked the flight attendant for a piece of paper and a pen. The attendant, confused but obliging, handed her what she had. With a few quick strokes, the woman scribbled her reply, an answer only someone from that world would understand. She held the note against the window, pressing it flat to the glass. One of the F-16s banked closer, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet glinting in the sun, the reflective visor turning toward her. He read it. And then, to the astonishment of every passenger who happened to be looking outside at that moment, the fighter plane dipped its wing in salute. Whispers rippled through the cabin. People asked each other if they had just seen that. The man with the phone fumbled to record, but the moment had already passed. To most of them, it was little more than an odd display of aviation etiquette. But to the few who truly understood, it was a gesture reserved for legends. The woman in 14C sat back, her chest tight, her throat dry. She hadn't wanted this. She had wanted anonymity, peace, a life without recognition. But here it was again thrust upon her. The call sign had given her away. The pilots outside weren't saluting a civilian passenger. They were saluting a war hero. Her story had begun decades earlier, long before she ever boarded this flight. She had been one of the first women to break into the combat ranks of her country's Air Force, a time when doors were barely cracked open for women, and skepticism was a louder opponent than any enemy aircraft. She had fought for her place in the cockpit with every hour of training, every grueling drill, every doubt cast at her. She had endured jeers, dismissals, and the constant test of having to be twice as good just to be considered equal. Her call sign had been more than a name. It was proof that she belonged. In war zones thousands of miles from home, she had flown missions that no one talked about publicly. Operations buried in classified files and whispered only in secure briefings. She had flown into danger zones where every second mattered, where one mistake meant never coming back. Her skill had saved lives, not just of her comrades in the air, but of soldiers on the ground who relied on her precision. Pilots who flew with her still told stories about her calm under fire, about the way she never flinched when everything went wrong. But none of that was known to the strangers sitting around her on the passenger plane. To them, she was just a woman traveling alone, quiet, unassuming. They didn't know the medals she had earned, the friends she had lost, or the price she had paid to wear those wings. They didn't know why she left or why she never looked back. And they certainly didn't know why. When the call sign echoed through the airwaves, her hands trembled ever so slightly. The flight went on, the hours ticking by, but everything felt different now. The crew in the cockpit, who had initially been told nothing more than escort procedure, had quietly received another message from the F-16s. The woman in 14C wasn't just a passenger. She was someone who had once commanded respect at the highest levels. The captain debated whether to say something, but in the end, discretion won. If she wanted to remain anonymous, that was her right. But the knowledge lingered in the cockpit like static. Meanwhile, the fighter escorts held their position. It was unusual for them to stay so close for so long. One of the pilots, unable to resist, made another subtle gesture, a hand raised in salute inside the canopy, visible if you knew where to look. She saw it, and for a moment her heart softened. These young men hadn't even been in uniform when she was flying, and yet they knew her. They had studied her missions and training, whispered her call sign in awe. To them, she wasn't just a pilot. She was a legend, but legends carry weight, and weight has a way of breaking you down. For all the admiration, for all the salutes, she also carried memories she could never put into words. The missions where the outcome was tragic, the orders that haunted her, the friends who didn't make it home. Her call sign wasn't just a badge of honor, it was also a reminder of ghosts that traveled with her, no matter how far she flew. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the cabin in gold light, the woman in 14C closed her eyes. She thought about the strange irony of it all. To the people around her, she was invisible. To the pilots outside, she was unforgettable. And though she had once sworn never to return to that world, she couldn't escape it. The sky remembered her. Even when she tried to forget, the passengers would never know the full truth. They would never know why the F-16 saluted. They would never know that the quiet woman in 14C had once carried the weight of an entire squadron on her shoulders. But the pilots outside knew, and that was enough. The hours of the flight dragged on, but for her, time had taken on a strange, elastic quality. The moment she heard her call sign echo through the airwaves, she was no longer just a passenger, bound for her destination. She was once again the pilot who had strapped into a cockpit with nothing but instinct, training, and courage to guide her through the firestorms of war. Yet here she was, a civilian, her call sign spoken by voices of a new generation. It was as if the past and present had collided at 35,000 feet. When the plane touched down for its refueling stop, the cabin lights brightened and the passengers stretched, yawning, eager to step onto solid ground. But as the jet taxied, she caught sight of something unusual. Beyond the terminal, lined neatly along the edge of the tarmac, stood 2 rows of military personnel. They weren't there for any dignitary, no head of state, no decorated general. And yet, the moment she stepped off that jet bridge, they would know her. Her heart pounded as the plane rolled to its gate. She had never asked for recognition. She had never told the world about her missions or her sacrifices. That was the code she had lived by. Do the job, serve the mission, and let history remain quiet. But apparently, history had refused to let her go. Passengers shuffled off one by one, dragging carry-ons and clutching passports. She tried to blend in, tried to disappear in the crowd. But as she reached the doorway, the captain of the flight stepped aside, almost reverently. "Ma'am," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with something between gratitude and awe. She gave him the faintest nod and walked down the ramp. When she stepped into the terminal, she froze. The soldiers on the tarmac outside had turned toward the glass windows, standing at rigid attention. And then, in perfect unison, they raised their hands in salute. Travelers in the terminal looked around in confusion, whispering, trying to see what was happening. Phones came out, cameras flashed. The woman in 14C lowered her head, trying to hide, but the salute followed her like a spotlight. She quickened her pace, vanishing into the crowd, determined not to let the weight of it crush her. Recognition was not what she wanted. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was peace. Yet peace had been the one thing denied to her since the first time she strapped herself into the cockpit of a fighter jet. That night, alone in her hotel room, she stared at her reflection in the darkened glass of the window. Beyond the city lights, she could still hear the faint roar of aircraft taking off. She thought of the salutes, of the call signs spoken by voices that hadn't been born when she first carried it. She thought of the young faces who looked at her as a symbol. Did they know the truth? Did they know the price? Her memories came back in fragments, as they always did. The endless training runs over desert ranges, the precision maneuvers that left her body aching, but her spirit unbroken. The night she led her squadron into a combat zone, a mission no one expected them to return from. The moment her wingman's voice went silent forever in her headset. The Air Force had given her medals for that night, medals she never looked at, medals she had shoved into a drawer like they meant nothing. But to her, that night had carved her soul apart. The call sign they used for her wasn't just a name. It was an identity forged in fire and blood. To the young pilots now, it represented courage. To her, it represented survival. It represented the faces she could still see every time she closed her eyes. And that was why she had walked away. That was why she had left the skies behind. The next morning, she boarded her connecting flight, trying again to vanish back into the folds of civilian life. She sat once more in seat 14C, as anonymous as she could be. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Not long after takeoff, the cabin shuddered faintly, the kind of turbulence that didn't alarm the crew but made the passengers glance nervously at one another. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but unusually measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received an escort request from NATO Command. Everything is fine, but we will be joined by military aircraft shortly." Her pulse quickened. Again. Out of the window, high above the clouds, came the familiar gleam of jet fighters, their angular forms slicing through the sky. This time, though, it wasn't just 2. It was 4. They formed up in a protective diamond pattern around the civilian aircraft. Passengers gasped, some thrilled, some frightened, some pressing their phones to the glass to capture the moment. But she knew what this was. This wasn't protocol. This was a message. The lead fighter pulled close, so close she could see the pilot's visor, and then it happened again. Her call sign crackled across the airwaves, this time not as a question, not as a search, but as a greeting. They knew she was there. They wanted her to know she was remembered. She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. For years she had run from it, buried it, tried to silence it. But here it was again, not haunting, not accusing, but honoring. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel the weight of shame or sorrow. She felt something else, pride. Passengers began whispering around her, piecing it together. Someone had overheard a flight attendant speaking to the captain. Someone else claimed to have heard the call sign over a radio frequency. Soon, the rumor spread like wildfire through the cabin that the quiet woman in 14C wasn't just a passenger. She was someone extraordinary. People stared wide-eyed, some respectful, some simply curious. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, refusing to confirm or deny. The jets held their formation all the way until the plane neared its destination. And then, in one final breathtaking display, the lead fighter dipped its nose, the others following suit, each giving the unmistakable gesture of salute. The passengers erupted in applause, some not even knowing why, only that they were witnessing something historic. She sat still, tears stinging her eyes, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. She had wanted to be forgotten. She had wanted only peace, but perhaps she realized peace didn't come from erasing the past. Perhaps it came from accepting it. When the plane landed and passengers disembarked, she once again slipped quietly into the crowd. There were no cameras waiting, no interviews, no speeches, only the fading roar of engines and the distant silhouettes of jets returning to the horizon. She walked into the terminal, a solitary figure, her call sign echoing only in her mind. For those who had witnessed it, the story of Seat 14C became something to tell and retell, a mystery, a legend whispered in airport lounges and online forums. But for her, it was simpler. It was the moment she realized that no matter how far she ran, the sky would always remember her. And sometimes remembering was not a burden, but a gift. She would never step into a cockpit again. She knew that part of her life was finished. But she also knew that when the young pilots saluted her across the endless blue, they weren't saluting her medals, or her missions, or even her survival. They were saluting the idea that courage mattered. That sacrifice was remembered. That call signs never truly died. The woman in 14C walked away from the airport, a small smile on her lips. She was, and always would be, a pilot. The world had reminded her of that, and in the quiet corners of the sky, the salute of the F-16s would forever follow her, an unspoken promise that she had not been forgotten. And so the legend of 14C lived on, not in headlines, not in official records, but in the hearts of those who saw it, those who heard the call sign, spoken with reverence, and those who believed that even in the vast anonymity of the modern world, a single life of courage could still make the sky itself stand still in respect.